Hello everybody. Just a bit of music to calm our nerves, as the subject is quite tough, quite powerful and maybe painful. I'm going to talk about fantasy versus reality principle. A very big subject. Again, a book can be written, or many books can be written. But at the beginning, let me just thank Christine for a lovely, lovely scarf. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, my subscribers. We are growing in number. So at the beginning, as I always do, let me just read something from my beloved Rumi, who seemed to be such a wise poet and man indeed. Let me just put my gloves on. The truth is yourself, but not your mere bodily self. Your real self is higher than you and me. This visible you, which you fancy to be yourself, is limited in place. The real you is not limited. Why, O pearl, linger you trembling in your shell? Esteem not yourself mere sugar cane, but real sugar. This outward you is foreign to your real you. Cling to your real self. Wonderful, wonderful. You see, cling to your real self. And I'm wavering this real self and reality, which real self comes from and goes to and is attached to, versus fantasy. Fantasy is not to have a fantastic tales or art as a fantasy or fairy tale, but fantasy as an escape from reality. Where that comes from? Obviously, as I am specializing in trauma healing and trauma therapy, it all starts from childhood. Any difficulties in childhood, any traumatic childhood, any troublesome childhood, whether it is an alcoholic background or violent background or borderline parents or sexual abuse or any horrendous things like that, could damage children enormously. What would the child do? The child could go totally schizophrenic, the child could go to total freeze, or very, very clever children, as I studied it for years, often go into fantasy realm. They simply escape the reality of family. They don't want to know it. They have their own magical world or the fantasy that can linger to adulthood. And that's where the problem starts. I can share with you that I'm an enormous fantasist in recovery and that it helped me to survive. I then went into book and become very much a bookaholic, high achiever, workaholic, etc. So fantasy as such very often is overlooked by my colleagues. We look at addiction in a sense of substance or behavior or even process. A fantasy belongs to that kind of addiction, a process addiction. Out of that addiction, very often it's gambling coming into the play, or indeed a love addiction. We women maybe are more prone to that kind of fantasy-based addiction, and it can rob us of our life completely. I always say that if we escape reality, that doesn't mean that we are crazy, because fantasy addict is not actually crazy. You can function very well in adult life. You can be exceptionally successful professionally, but maybe a total failure in relationship. Individual relationship based on fantasy means that we often probably attract narcissistic people one way or another, whether men or women, because they will spot us. They will spot us that we are naive and that we as possibly more empathetic human beings would go into fantasy and prolong the agony sometimes for years and years and years. We simply deny the reality. William Blake once said, if door of perception was cleansed, everything would appear to be as it is, and infinite. One of our Polish philosophers talk about reality versus fantasy in the words that we must never turn ourselves back on reality because it surrounds us. So it's also reality of our inner life. But those two things, a fantasy and reality, really do not go together. And yet in some way do. Fantasy helps us to survive the reality. And we might live the whole life without even encountering ourselves, because to encounter ourselves we have to go to reality. Of course you can ignore it. Of course you can ignore it, reality altogether. But what we cannot ignore it is the consequence of ignoring the reality. So a fantasy, we don't bother. With fantasy, we don't bother about consequence. What we bother with fantasy is that people leave us alone, or that we have that bubble. We have that comfort. We bring ourselves to that. We bumble through life, and we not really worry. We push aside like a child. Reality is not really mean much to us. Love addicts often suffer, therefore, all fantasy addicts, from anxiety, from depression, from absolute exhaustion, because fantasies, love addicts very often spend their time pleasing others, and that by itself robs them of their life. Fantasy also changes the process, biochemical process, and it does change the brain. We are not aware of it because, especially if we're clever and accomplished, we praise ourselves that nothing wrong with our brain. However, that lingering reality, I work for years and I've heard variation on reality addiction galore. I can probably write 12 volumes on it. Reality is about sobriety. Fantasy is about not being sober. If you live with a reality principle, you know that some people are shifty, you know that some people are not so good, and you can accept it quicker. When you go into fantasy, you will fantasize that maybe next year or next week or next month or 3 months that he or she will come around and love us dearly. I always say, particularly with lies, compulsive liars, if you have a killer, you know that they will kill you. If you have a thief, you know that they will rob you. But if you have a liar, you will never ever know what liars will do. So the fantasy and liars often go together, sadly. The fantasies suffer from a particular naivety because they push aside suffering, they push aside acknowledging. Reality principle is what relationships are all about, and reality principle is what finances are all about. So gamblers often are fantasists. They want to win something, yeah? They want to have something drop onto them from the heaven. So I often ask my patients, are you available for reality? Ask yourself whether you are available, because maybe you're not. Well, I'm not drinking, I'm not taking drugs. What do you mean I'm not available for reality? Well, I often say, you might not drink, you might not take drugs, but think about your fantasy addiction. They never ever think about fantasy as an addiction. I know that fantasy is addiction, and the price of fantasy addiction is sometimes probably much more horrendous than even a drink. We never satisfied with fantasy. We want to be free from reality through escaping into sleeping or escaping into playing games with children. The fantasy is a phenomenal tool to escape reality and escape pain. One of the patients of mine said that I spent my entire life overdosing on escapism and the fantasy, and I've never allowed reality to come any near me, and that is exactly what happens. reality will rob you of development. Reality will rob you of opportunities, and above all of creativity. Just because we are in fantasy, just because we can be talkative, just because we can tell a tale, doesn't mean that we are responsible. Because what is reality connected to is responsible. What is responsible is ability to respond. Well, fantasy will have nothing to do with ability to respond. Noam Chomsky, a wonderful linguist and philosopher, remarkable man, said, if we choose, we can live in a world of comforting illusions and delusions and fantasies. But is that good? So if we live in the fantasy world, the world of illusion, that means that we will never find a reality. And there is a profound power in reality. I call that a spirituality connected to reality, because it's only there you can find yourself. The fantasy you think is much better. And my analyst used to say, well, Maya, you just have to fall in love with your suffering and with your reality. And I thought she was really, really not so good to tell me that I have to fall in love with reality, because I thought I went to her to get rid of it, so to speak. I was already in a fantasy realm anyhow. And she was very kind, but tough as an old. But she was experienced and profoundly a loving woman. So fantasy is very often at the bottom of a love addiction, sex addiction, maybe even more love than sex addiction. You, as a fantasist, you don't have to respect yourself. You don't have to be grateful to do anything. You can find yourself escaping in millions of ways, and you don't have to stress yourself. You don't have to feel rejected. So a fantasy addiction means that you means that we cannot meet ourselves. And as Ralph Emerson put it, we must be our own before we can be with another's. So can we really do it? Fantasy will not allow us. Even the boys, young boys who fantasize that they all will be footballers, and they're encouraged to do it, yeah? There's one thing to encourage to be sporty, to grow, to be agile, and another is to condemn that they all will become, Diego or Beckham. I often ask people, can you make fantasy a necessary ingredients of living? You can't as an adult. You have to very often as a child, and that is a difference. I've read some anonymous quote, God doesn't send you the people you want, He gives you the people you need to help you, to hurt you, to dump you, to lose you, and to make you the person you meant to be. So for the fantasist, it's a shocking thing. How can God do that to me? The fantasist finds difficulty in going to the reality all the time. How, and therefore blames God all the time and feels terribly sorry for themselves. Responsibility equals freedom. Freedom has got nothing to do with fantasy. Fantasy is the greatest prison, probably the greatest, and the most common. I love you for forever, you are my twin lover, all that lines full of absolutely creepy promises which fantasists will swallow like goose, a good feed to get a good liver. The fantasy as a means of escaping reality is the greatest con. The happiness is not about the fantasy. The happiness is about the power, which means empowering within and empowering with the reality. Because perfect men and perfect women don't exist, we obviously have to accept that we are all faulty and that we all great disappointments And God still loves us, as many mentors of mine said. I'm just my own disappointment, and I am my own failure. And I can tell you at my age and with my experience, that is exactly how I feel. When we are in a way broken down or broken to pieces, that we can come through to reality, that's where we in a way find our soul and grow into our soul. So this saying, which we say very often in 12-step meetings, for who I am and what I am responsible today, is a wonderful saying. Too much fantasy loses reality. As Albert Einstein said, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. In other words, reality is the illusion which is worth knowing. Kierkegaard once said, life is not the problem to be solved, but the reality to be experienced. And this is what it means. It means it's a spiritual experience. It's not about religious, it's a spirituality. To own our reality, as one of the Vietnamese Buddhist monks said, is to sit in the lap of God, to be enveloped by grace, to be enveloped by God. So it's not to be enveloped by fantasy. As children, we think that that's the best we can do. As adults, we have to know. Since we are different from one person to another, we have to accept that, and it's the reality which gives us peace. It gives us peace in the body, in the spirit, in the mind, in the emotions. And that's why I like the saying of Jesus, I give you my peace. The peace I give you. Well, Jesus, of course, was a conscious human being, and he was at peace. The reality and acceptance of our reality would give us that peace. It's being in reality. It's like resting in God, or feeling in love with your own reality is what it is all about. Buddha once said, "In the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gratefully you let go of things. Gracefully you let go of things which not meant for you." Let me just read a lovely blessing at the end, and we shall say Serenity Prayer. This is an Irish blessing, a very beautiful poem, which I'll read it to you. Blessed be the longing that brought you here, and that quickens your soul with wonder. May you have the courage to befriend your eternal longing. May you enjoy the critical and creative companionship of the question, who am I? And may it brightens your longing. May a secret providence guide your thoughts and shelter your feelings. May your mind inhabit your life with the same sureness with which your body belongs in the world. May the sense of something absent enlarge your life. May your soul be as free as the ever-new waves of the sea. May you succumb to the danger of growth. May you live in the neighborhood of wonder. May you belong to love with the wildness of dance. May you know that you are ever embraced in the kind circle of God. So let's say Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference.